This is Chapter 1 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled High Score. It had been 3 months since Pinkamena seen death incarnate in the Sweet Apple Acres orchard. The Pinky sense had been strangely quiet since then. Death was either patient or absent for the moment. It bothered her. It felt like a steady pressure of paranoia was building up inside her, and she didn't know how to combat it. She could only keep dreaming about the skeletal stallion in the heavy cloak, standing in the black mist of the moonlit night, chilling. Pinkamena awoke with a flinch, her scowling face hardening for a moment while her brain struggled to start up. She still wasn't used to waking up in the morning every day, nor was she used to having a rather handsome stallion wrapped around her most of the way. She turned her head, her curtain-like mane shifting when she lifted it to get a better look at him. Lickety-Split was her stallion, more or less. They lived together, ate together, slept together, and so on. They weren't married, at least not yet, but Pinkamena was in no hurry. He was handsome, delightfully submissive, and a vigorous lover. She liked everything as it was. Peering at him, she scented his mint-green mane and touched a hoof to his white fur. Vanilla. He smelled so feminine for a stallion. It annoyed her to no end. But he owned an ice cream parlor, so there was little to be done for it. Smirking with a smile that would chill blood, she nosed him a few times in a half-playful way. Hers. She liked that. He stirred slightly at her prodding, murred quietly, and then buried his face between her front hooves at her breast. It was warm and soft there. Never mind the morning. He wasn't awake yet. Not at all. Her smile widened into a rather cruel expression as she bit him on the ear instead. Ouch! He tumbled out of the bed, taking the comforter and sheet with him. Pinkamena! He moaned, looking at her blearily and setting his chin on the edge of the bed, laying on her side with her whole undercarriage on display for him. She smiled at him in a sultry way from behind her long mane. It made her look moody, dangerous, and sexy. Morning to you too, he said after his eyes had flicked guiltily back and forth a few times. They rose, going through their normal rituals of preparing for the new day. Pinkamena didn't enjoy working at an ice cream parlor, but it was honest work and her lover paid her generously. She kept the place spotless and attacked the sidewalk with a broom every morning to keep it looking decent. That morning, while she was glaring at a dry piece of gum dirtying her stoop, the pink mare was suddenly assaulted by a white one. An ear-splitting kazoo startled her into rearing up when Surprise threw confetti on her with a squeal of happiness. Surprise! Happy 3 months of being in 2 bodies, Pinkamena! The blonde-headed mare defied gravity for a long moment with her arms splayed out in jubilation. It's been 3 whole months since Princess Luna murdered us both and brought my soul back from the land of the dead, which was super weird because I was half of a soul and you were the other half, which means that you half died. Did I half die too? I don't remember. You were the one in control and we got... Pinkamena's temper had already run high and she grabbed Surprise by the face with one hoof, hauling her back down to earth. Brainless imbecile. What do you want? She said slowly. Despite the pink mare's attempts to keep herself quite separate from Surprise, they sort of had a pseudo-sisterhood between themselves now. They were, technically, the same mare, just different aspects in different bodies. Surprise insisted on frequent visits despite any abuse Pinkamena ever dealt out. Surprise! The ghostly white mare spazzed again, pulling from Pinkamena's suppressing hoof. I've finally gotten around to getting the recipe for ice cream cake. I came here to pick up a bucket or 2 of high-quality vanilla ice cream. She grinned a great big huge grin that the dignified pink mare instantly hated. Speaking of... Surprise leaned in a little conspiratorially. You and Lickety-Split have been living together for a while now. Have you two been making, ice cream cake? Pinkamena had to work very, very hard to not buck the white mare in her big stupid head, and instead slapped her hooves away. "Keep your hooves off my stallion," she warned dangerously, scowling like the plague. It was no secret Surprise liked Lickety Split, and when she was Pinkie Pie had harbored a crush on him. "Hey, Surprise!" Lickety Split had appeared in the doorway to prop the glass door open and let in the early fall air. "Nice to see you again so soon." Surprise sproinged into the air, then into the shop to make her purchase. Pinkamena scowled, attacking the sidewalk with her broom and then glaring the white mare away when she bounced away down the sidewalk. Her stallion reappeared in the doorway of the parlor, smiling gently. "Don't be jealous. Her looking doesn't hurt anything," he soothed. "She should look elsewhere." Pinkamena scowled, possessive of him. "What about me? Doesn't my fidelity count for anything?" he said softly. Pinkamena's expression softened a little, and she silently extended her neck. He nuzzled it up and then back down. She allowed herself a small crooning sound, and he kissed her cheek. Going back inside, he left her to her work while he was making sure the shop was ready to go for the day. Sure enough, a foal and mother mare were sitting at the bar with sundaes within the next 5 minutes. Pinkamena stared at the foal with a certain expression. He was a charming little thing, a colt with a silly propeller hat on his head. He could often be seen haunting arcade machines when they were brought out for festivals like Hearts and Hooves Day. It didn't take long for the pink mare to spot the bracelet around his left front hoof, a hospital bracelet. Her hawkish eyes narrowed while traveling down his tiny little body while he was eating a chunk of banana with gusto. His ribs were showing just a little. Pinkamena's eyes flicked to the mother. She looked a little tired for so early in the morning. He must have been very sickly, the poor thing. An icy feeling touched the back of Pinkamena's neck. She shuddered, then cocked her head. She knew that feeling. She snapped around, looking back and forth out on the street. A few ponies were already out doing their morning shopping and other errands, but he was still there. He stuck out like a black blot of ink in the white room in the palace. "I see you," Pinkamena whispered. Her brow lowered until she glared at him from under her eyebrows. Her expression darkened and her pink mane fell slowly over half her face. In the alleyway across the street stood Death. The skeletal pony stared back, his sudden stillness telling her that he'd seen her see him. His black eye sockets flickered with red, the breeze tossing his cloak briefly. She saw the bleached white skeleton beneath, not even a flank for a cutie mark. No skin. They stared at each other for a long time. He said nothing, only looked at her from across the way. Black mist that came from nowhere at all was curling idly around his hooves. Pinkamena finally shuddered, tearing her gaze away. From within the ice cream parlor, she heard the colt suddenly say, "Mommy, I feel a little funny." The pink mare's mouth went agape for a moment and she rushed to the doorway. The colt was holding his chest and breathing a little hard. The mother turned, looking alarmed. Then, slowly, the feeling seemed to pass and he smiled in a tired way. "Oh, I guess it was nothing." His small voice was weak and his breathing labored. "We should go back to the doctor right now," his mother decided promptly. "Can't I finish my sundae? Please?" The little colt begged with big, soft eyes before he could be yanked off his stool. The mare considered, then sighed and lowered herself onto the stool she was on again. A few more minutes couldn't hurt. "Yay!" He had his spoon again, shoveling ice cream greedily like the happy child he was. From behind the counter, Lickety Split smiled gently at the mother. Pinkamena turned and glared across the street at Death. "Don't you bucking dare!" She snarled savagely, still whispering. "Not under my roof. Preventing death is my special talent, so back right the buck off." She felt angry and protective very suddenly. She turned sideways, flashing the white skull and black scythe on her flank. The cutie mark of death prevention. Death inclined its head in a rather eloquent bow. Was that submission? Was just telling him off enough? The mare was as surprised when he backed off a step, his skeletal frame rattling a little. Was she like some sort of voodoo fetish now, able to stave off death by just being there and swearing at him? "Thanks, Mr. Lickety-Split." The mother mare was leaving with her colt now, calling out loudly to set a good example for her son. The stallion behind the counter smiled good-naturedly, waving at them both as they exited the ice cream parlor. "Yeah, thanks, Mr. Lickety." Suddenly the colt stutter-stepped, clutched at himself, then fell and died on the sidewalk. His mother's screams could be heard all across the still sleepy Ponyville. Pinkamena went pale, then shot a venomous glare across the street at Death. The skeletal stallion tossed his head a few times, his jaw clacking, with his teeth striking each other. It reminded the pink mare too much of laughter. She only vaguely heard Lickety-Split rushing outside and shouting for help, any pony to send for help. Pinkamena stood stock still, staring across the street at the specter that no pony else could seem to see. A little blob of orange, puffy cloud appeared next to Death. Shepherding it gently under its cloak, he seemed to consume the little soul into his own being. It took her a few long moments to realize that it had waited until the little colt had come outside to claim him. By the time she turned to shout obscenities at him, he had vanished into thin air. Cheeky bastard. In the highest room, in the tallest tower, both royal sisters stood watching Ponyville. Through the eyes of the goddesses, they might as well have been standing there when the entire scene had unfolded. The death of the little one had visibly shaken Celestia. It had all been so fast. Luna, princess of the night, of death and fertility, turned her muzzle up a little. "We did not expect such a response," she admitted with a snap of her wings. "The pink one is ever vigilant, it seems." "She didn't expect it," Celestia said gently, her voice a soothing balm over her sister's snappish ways. The white alicorn turned, ever trying to be the diplomat between the mortal races and her sister. "It is enough to catch any pony off guard. Such a sudden death." "The little one's demise hath shaken her," Luna said with some satisfaction. "But her anger will elicit more insolence. We know this," she said, stamping a hoof. Cracks spiderwebbed away from the impact. The 4 stallions, 2 solar and 2 lunar, standing guard, flinched when the room vibrated at her wrath. "She will not be able to help herself after the appearance of such a cutie mark, a special talent of death prevention." She gestured to the pink mare's flank, a white skull with a black scythe. "If she defies even ourself, then a cloaked spectre like Death shalt not sway her." Her voice vibrated the room angrily, and Celestia gave her a look. She lowered her voice a little. "This shalt not end well, sister," she said, a look of mild concern crossing her muzzle. "Even we do not trifle with the pony called Death." No, we do not," Celestia said mildly. "Pinkamena was given all the warnings and threats we could offer to her. She looked over at her sister and extended a comforting wing. "From you especially, sister." They shared a quiet moment of affectionate siblings. Though Luna's ways were more hostile and certainly louder, they both adhered to the same grand design, and Celestia knew it. The princess of the night leaned into her solar counterpart, and they nuzzled quietly. It was a time before the goddess of the day spoke again. She may not understand that you tried to save her somewhat after you executed her, that is. Celestia smiled gently at her sister's insulted look. But I am afraid she will have to be on her own now. Luna nodded in silent agreement, sighing. This is Chapter 2 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Big Macintosh. It's almost funny to watch you squirm, you know. It's not often any pony takes such a grudge interest against death, Mother Nature said with a little smile. She gave her orange mane a haughty little toss. Death scowled at her, pulling back his hood. She rolled her eyes at him. He always did that when he wanted to be more intimidating, but it didn't work on her anymore. She'd been an aspect for too long. Are you going to do anything about her, or... Death nodded slowly, his teeth clacking a few times. The poor stallion didn't have a tongue to speak with in his aspect form, so it was all he could do to nod or make bodily gestures. Mother Nature smiled sympathetically as he took his place at the round table across from her. He inclined his head a little. She knew the subtleties of his body language well enough to know it was his scolding gesture. All right, the mayor conceded. I remember, no talk of business on poker night. We're still waiting for Father Time, though. Death bobbed his head a few times. With a pop of parted air, a brown stallion with an hourglass on his flank snapped into being on the far side of the room. So sorry, chaps, the little one had taken ill. I could have gone back in time a few hours or something, but then I would have been in two places at once, and that's never good. Dr. Hooves, known to that gathering as Father Time, gently set a tray of cornbread and English muffins on the table. A bar of soft butter and a few knives were on the tray as well. I did remember the snacks this time, though. Very important snacks on poker night. He chuckled merrily. Death and Mother Nature nodded with approval, both smiling. So, if I remember right, it's Mother Nature's turn to deal, he said, cocking his head at their dark-robed friend. You can take that silly thing off, you know, Mother Nature said to Death. I've pulled all my shutters and locked all my doors. No one will see us here like this. Death hesitated for a long moment, looking back and forth between the two of them. You won't be able to have cornbread and muffins with no stomach or cheeks, you know, Mother Nature teased him, gesturing to the delicious-looking tray of treats. Finally, Death made his sighing body language gesture and pulled off his robe entirely. He stood naked, a bleach-white skeleton with hooves. Then organs, muscle, fur, and coloring exploded across him as wildfire. His aspect form was molded over by a more solid and mortal form, blood and muscle and fur. Soon, he looked like any pony one might pass on the street. Standing there, smoking idly for a moment, the stallion shook his mane out, looking a little frazzled. Mother Nature quickly rose and waved a newspaper at her smoke detectors so they wouldn't go off again. Death's transformations were always so dramatic. I must say, old chap, you do look much better in your skin, said Father Time, buttering a piece of cornbread and passing half to Death. Death smiled in a tired way, reaching across the table and stuffing it in his mouth. He did enjoy the taste of good butter. It got the crisp taste of ashes off of his tongue. Deal, he said to Mother Nature, who nodded and started shuffling the cards. The three aspects settled in for their regular poker night, each setting a stack of 50 bits next to themselves for betting. Big Macintosh was working on his plow in the barn. It had been too long since he'd stopped to sharpen it. His mouth set in a neutral line and his eyes lidded in concentration. He ran the whetstone back and forth over it. He knew it had grown dull when a rock the size of an apple had stopped him entirely. Although it was almost winter time, there was still plowing to be done. It was very, very important to turn the soil to make sure it stayed fertile and good for crops. Dead leaves and other debris had been falling over the fields throughout fall. Now it was time to mix it all in. It was like a giant compost heap, to be honest. Smiling and content with his lot in life, the massive stallion worked in silence. "Hey, Big Mac!" Applebloom cantered into the barn. The stallion turned, file still in his mouth. He smiled, bobbing his head once in acknowledgement. "Applejack says that the showers and such in the house are fixed now." The little filly leaned close, conspiratorial. "I think she pulled a big orange ball of hair out of one of the main pipes. She's been soaking and brushing her mane like crazy." Big Macintosh chuckled good-naturedly, shaking his head at her. Setting the file down neatly and admiring his work, he looked at Applebloom for approval. He did like to include his little sister in things so she felt like she was helping. "Why, Big Mac, that looks as sharp as a tack," she said, leaning over the freshly sharpened plow. "I bet you could cut through solid rock with that." "Yup," he said, pressing it to one side with the top of his head so no pony would trip over it. When the file was put away with the other tools, he took Applebloom's hint and headed for the showers in the house. Winter was truly a lazy time for the Apple family, but it was their vacation time, truth be told. They had to work very, very hard all year, but they couldn't exactly grow apples in the winter time. So Big Mac would often pray for snow so he could run around with a snowplow to earn an extra hooful of bits now and then. It didn't happen often, so it wasn't uncommon for him to spend weeks in the barn with all their tools, sharpening, filing, shining, and cleaning. But for now, it was evening, and that meant shower time. It got dark early in the winter, and there wasn't any sense in staying out to freeze and get sick. Applebloom trotted alongside beside her big brother, smiling merrily as they went. She stepped inside, into the welcoming embrace of the Apple family home. It snuggled her with warm air and pleasant smells of a late evening dinner cooking. "Don't you be going to the dinner table smelling like you do, big brother," Applebloom teased as the massive stallion made for the stairs towards the upstairs bathroom. Big Macintosh rolled his eyes, smiling. If there was one guilty pleasure he had in life, it was having his own bathroom. Living in a household of mares and fillies left certain things in the bathroom that stallions didn't need to see nor worry about, according to Granny Smith. So he'd been given his own bathroom to make up for it. Applebloom and Applejack often teased that it was the little colt's room, and never went in there themselves. It was just a bathroom, but it was something that was just for Big Mac, and he liked that. Sighing, the barrel-chested stallion arrived there and turned the water on. Pulling the door in the shower curtain, he stepped under the spray. The hot water felt great compared to the cold winter air outside. It made him tingle. Closing his eyes, he stood there for a long time just to let himself thaw out before reaching for the apple spice body wash on the edge of the tub. A pink hoof grabbed him and he gave a throaty cry. Pushing the shower curtain rudely open was none other than Pinkamena. "Got you!" She hauled him bodily out of the tub. Not an easy feat considering his size. Just then, the water in the shower spattered a little and a deluge hit the tub like a pressure washer. The powerful splash knocked the bathroom light out, exploding a light bulb and sending a huge live wire down from the ceiling into the bath. The hum of electricity was loud. Pinkamena hauled Big Macintosh back and back, for he was trailing water, and the electricity would fry him in an instant. Pony feathers! Pinkamena looked back and forth, dragging the confused and now terrified stallion away from the pooling water on the floor. Snarling, she turned and shoved him out the second-story window. Big Mac fell with a wordless cry, and Pinkamena rappelled down on the grappling hook and rope she'd used to sneak into the house. She found him upside down in some hedges, soaking wet and shaking in the cold winter night. He fell with a bump, his weight finally dragging him out of the bush and onto the ground. She emerged soon after, panting with effort. You'll need to cut the power to the house and to soak up the water. Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes widening in horror. Yup," he chattered, freezing. Then he saw where her eyes had gone and frowned a little bashfully. Big Macintosh's crimson fur had been weighted down with the water from the shower, and it made it easier to see the skin beneath. Across his chest and neck was a massive, jagged scar. It ran from his Adam's apple, across his vocal cords, down through to his underbelly without even stopping. Pinkamena didn't want to imagine what sort of blade or farm implement had done that to him. "So that's why you don't talk very much," Pinkamena mumbled, fighting the urge to run her hoof across the spectacular scar. "Whatever happened, it must have ripped your vocal cords wide open. Speaking must be very painful for you," she surmised. Big Macintosh looked to one side, then to the other, uncomfortable. "Yup," he said softly after a time. The pink mare looked at him in a new light. He'd never mentioned it publicly or to any of their friends. She'd always assumed he was just shy, but no, speaking physically hurt him. "I won't tell," she offered with an even look. He seemed comforted by this and nodded a few times at her. "Get back inside before you get sick and die anyway. Rope climbing isn't easy, you know. It took a lot of effort to climb up there. I would hate to have wasted all that effort." She affixed him with a scowl that made him wilt away a little. Once she'd mentioned it, she remembered to reclaim her rope and grappling hook. Rolling it up in coils, she stuffed it in her saddlebags. Big Macintosh turned and quickly went inside through the front door, closing it behind him. Then, he thought better and stuck his soaking wet head back outside again, working his mouth so he could speak. Pinkamena had already vanished into the cold winter's night. The stallion rubbed his throat painfully. It really did hurt him to talk, but he wouldn't be talking at all if not for her. Now all he would have to do is explain how he'd gotten outside from the upstairs bathroom. He somehow doubted his sisters would believe a strange mare had shoved him right out the window. Pinkamena was long gone. "I know you work in an ice cream parlor, honey, but you really should bundle up when you go out that late," Lickety-Split said gently. She shot him a glare that said, "Don't call me honey," but he pressed a little more. "You were preventing some pony's death tonight, weren't you?" He smiled a little when Pinkamena put her saddlebags on a side table by the door. It tilted and a grappling hook fell out, trailing rope behind it. "Scaling walls now? Gonna be the next mare-duel?" he teased, going and kissing her cheek. She smiled idly, nuzzling him with her cheek. It was nice to have praise, just a little bit, especially from such a handsome stallion. She flopped onto the couch, heaving a relieved sigh as she let the warmth of their little abode thaw her from the cruel winter's bite. "I didn't see him this time," Pinkamena said, frowning at the wall idly. Big Macintosh was going to be electrocuted in his own shower, fried, way past dead. She saw her lover wince at her graphic telling. "Death, I didn't see him there," she confided in him as he joined her on the couch with a concerned look. Maybe he wouldn't, or maybe he would have survived, or staggered out of the shower when the water pressure went way up before the light bulb burst." She went over the details with him and he listened carefully. "I think you saved him, without a doubt." Lickety-Split pressed his muzzle into her mane, nuzzling up and down a few times to soothe her. She relaxed a few more inches, then laid her chin on the arm of the couch. He smiled at his personal victory, pulling the quilt off the back of the couch to drape over her. Cuddling up to her comfortingly, he helped her warm up for the evening while they lay there on the couch. "But that is a little weird. You've seen death as a stallion twice now," he pondered, looking at the ceiling. Maybe he was busy elsewhere. Death doesn't take nights off, Pinkamena said grouchily. She turned and lay on her side, facing him. Does he? Lickety-Split chuckled at her words, leaning to peck her cheek again. She sighed, relaxing at last. Ah well, a victory was a victory, whether it made sense or not. Pushing her curtain-like pink mane behind her ear, she relaxed into her stallion's arms at last. He stroked her comfortingly. Wait, Lickety-Split said after a time. What were you doing watching Big Macintosh take a shower? He wondered aloud. She kicked him as soon as he started laughing. Death pulled his cloak back on, pulling the hood up and snapping the brooch-like clasp into place around his neck. His flesh burned away suddenly, his eyeballs exploding and his mane going up like straw on a bonfire. His veins and muscles melted into goo and then vanished. He reared up a little, slamming his front hooves down. When the fires went out, he stood there smoking, teeth clattering. He was once again a cloaked skeleton. Mother Nature stood from the table, waving her newspaper back and forth in front of the smoke detector. "Faust, damn it, Death!" she screeched, standing on a chair as she did it and trying to reset the little device. "Out! Out! Out! Out!" She took him by the cloak and Father Time by the ear. "I told you to stop transforming in my house!" Shuffling both stallions out of her little house, she slammed the door on them. Father Time looked at Death with a little smirk. They both knew Death did it just to excite Mother Nature. It was fun to watch her dance about like that, trying to keep things in balance even in her own house. "I'd say she was just angry because she lost, personally. Know what I mean?" Father Time snickered a little as they went down the sidewalk. They passed Mother Nature's rather impressive carrot patch, then used the tiny gate to get out of her yard before she came outside to throw things at them. Death clattered his teeth, tossing his head. That was his heavy laughter gesture. "Well then, I think I'm going to take the rest of the evening off as well." Reaching up, Father Time removed his crimson bow tie and collar. When he took it off, his aspect powers winked out and he was a normal stallion once more. Death saw none other than Dr. Hooves cantering down the sidewalk to his left. The skeletal stallion stood there for a few moments, relishing in the chill of the night. Winter was setting in. That meant plenty of deaths by cold. Heck, it also meant most plant life was going dead. This was his busiest time of the year. The cruel breeze rattled through his ribcage and he pulled his cloak tight about himself. He tossed his head a few times, the bones of his neck clattering. Death was just about to take his leave when another pony approached. Father Time, wearing his red bow tie and collar again. Death turned, for Dr. Hooves had turned the corner only a moment ago. Approaching from the right side, quite the opposite of the way he'd left, the brown stallion cantered past Death. "Sorry, had to jump straight back here. I forgot my tray at Mother Nature's table. Can't have that, never see it again." If Death had eyeballs right then, he would have rolled them. Father Time was such a charming, if odd, stallion. Something about the way he often talked in rapid-fire sentence fragments made him very likable. It didn't keep him from getting it hit in the face with his own serving tray, though. Mother Nature was very cranky. Death's teeth clattered with silent laughter. This is Chapter 3 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Twilight Sparkle. There are two kinds of death that Death the Stallion knew. He thought about them as he paced the hall of the Ponyville Hospital. There was natural death, which was when one's life cycle simply ran out or something unusual happened. Then there was karmatic death, in which an aspect like himself was supposed to step in to make sure it happened. Karma was not something even he could quantify. He only knew who and where to be when theirs was up. He was thankful that some deaths took care of themselves. But not this one. The mare he was waiting for had eluded death too many times for her to have a natural death anymore. Death leaned into the room, an operating theater. She was under the knife for perhaps the 6th time in the last decade. She was old, very old, and clinging to life like an angry vulture. He didn't like that. Medical science prevented a lot of deaths, but in a more frugal manner than one might expect. It was only now and then that a surgeon truly pulled a pony back from death's grasp. It irked him. Now, finally, was his chance to snatch her from the mortal coil. If you asked him, Death would admit that there was a certain satisfaction in causing the deaths of those that had eluded it for so long. Every pony got an equal chance at life, and hers was more than spent. Now he could move to assassinate her, as was his job as the aspect of death. When he confirmed his target's presence, he swept into the room. The room was bright, sterile, and quite chilly. It was filled with a little group of nurses, several doctors, and a trio of surgeons. Death hadn't bothered to find out what sort of surgery it was. It didn't really matter. None of the ponies saw him. None could ever see Death coming unless they happened to be an aspect, or that strange pink mare. He'd think on her more later. Right now he was working. Leaning over the operation table, he reached out with a chilly hoof. It passed through the body and into her chest cavity. Growling, he fished around for the soul. Ah, there it was, hiding behind her left lung. If anyone ever asks, your soul is usually either behind your left lung or next to your kidney. Whoever said it was in your heart or mind was just pulling your leg. Reaching rudely up to his shoulder and her body, he pulled the mare's soul out. It was like a sticky cobweb, clinging to the body. Just then, all sorts of medical machines started going off. The doctors started to panic and the surgeons to sweat. Nurses rushed back and forth. They were all trying to save the elderly mare until she was gone. Her chest rose up, then deflated for the last time. Death gently pushed the soul, a sticky little blob of cloud, under his cloak. It was thick with the experiences of a long life, and would no doubt have no issues working to the great beyond. He looked up at the fallen faces of the surgeons and nurses. He'd grown used to those looks years ago, and they no longer affected him. Sweeping from the room, he paused in the terminal illness hall to pick up 2 more souls, then another in a different wing. Hospitals were often the place for death to interfere, and by the time he came away from the building, he had 8 souls under his cloak. They floated meagerly in his rib cage. He hadn't really eaten them, per se, but he didn't exactly have pockets. That seemed as good of a place as any to keep them safe. Souls were precious, after all. Death would have sighed if he had lungs. Now then, the pink one. He would have to go observe her in his mortal form. Death incarnate could not go anywhere that wasn't expecting a death, so he would have to be somewhat undercover. Or perhaps... Wait. There was a karmatic death approaching. Turning to follow the tingle running down his spine, Death found his eyes resting on the Ponyville Library. Cantering down the street, seen by no pony at all, he walked, ghost-like, through the door. His cloak made him more than just bony-looking. Peering around at the shelves and shelves of books, he wasn't sure any pony was home until he heard a crashing of glass downstairs. Sweeping down the stairs, he found a lavender mare working busily to clean up a chemical stain on the floor. It looked like some sort of science lab. Ooh, the perfect place for an untimely death, he smiled inwardly. Ugh, Twilight Sparkle said. I'm never going to get this right, she pouted, igniting her horn with magic to turn on a Bunsen burner and try again. Turning, she studied the 3 chalkboard sheet filled with calculations, formulae, and flowing charts. Death stared at them all, but he couldn't make heads or tails of them. But if a karmatic death was due around here somewhere, perhaps he could do a bit more. Twilight was busily writing on the first chalkboard with a floating piece of chalk, her face scrunched into an adorable expression of concentration. She looked over her shoulder at her chemistry setup. That was right. Oh, no, that needed adjusting. Twilight went over and busily started adjusting the plastic tubes around the glass vials and containers. While her back was turned, Death changed a singular number in Twilight Sparkle's calculations. He had no idea what said number would change, but if the last number had made a file explode, then surely a higher one would make an even greater effect. He was careful not to smudge it so it wouldn't look like it had been altered. Then he stood back. Twilight returned to the chalkboards, eyeing the long formula with a critical eye. "Oh, that's what I did wrong," she chuckled merrily, turning round to make the adjustment he'd made in her mathematics. Death waited, smiling inwardly. It wasn't often he got serious fireworks with some pony's death. Twilight Sparkle funneled all the desired chemicals into a beaker, heated it, turned it so it would filter into another beaker, stirred it lightly with a glass prod, then went over to her vial rack. Taking 2 of them from the selection, she went back to the concoction. Leaning close, she held her breath as she undid the stoppers. 1 drop of each would do. Her tongue came out of her mouth, curling up in concentration. Death leaned forward eagerly. The first one dripped. The mixture hissed and frothed violently. The second vial tilted. "Twilight, no!" Pinkamena thundered down the stairs into Twilight's lab, tackling her mightily. The mare squealed when they both hit the wall with a crash. The vial went careening out of control and broke on the floor, burning a hole in the wood with a loud hiss. "Pinkamena, what are you doing?" Twilight squealed, shoving the mare off of her with a cry. "Saving your life!" Pinkamena snapped, righting herself with a toss of her mane. "You practically gave me whiplash," Twilight complained, getting up and rubbing the back of her mane. "Did you have to tackle me like that?" She moaned a little, sore from the assault. "It's better than you blowing yourself up," Pinkamena said angrily, turning and sweeping her gaze across the room. There he was. "I see you," she mouthed at the specter of death. He shuddered with unbridled anger, teeth clattering in his head. An insufferable cotton-candy-maned wretch. How did she know? "This experiment is perfectly safe." Twilight gestured to her 3 chalkboards. "I've made all the calculations perfectly." "No, you didn't. You were about to blow yourself up," Pinkamena said firmly. "Check it again." Twilight Sparkle rolled her eyes. She doubted very much that Pinkamena could grasp such advanced calculations, but if it would get her out of her lab sooner, fine. She leaned with a discerning eye. That was fine. The amount was good. Then there was the heat. Yes, that was... No, it wasn't. That was way too hot. What? Twilight stepped back, reworking the problem in her head without even writing it. "But if it's that hot, it would react far more violently and..." "Explode like a powder keg?" Pinkamena offered, turning her nose up and closing her eyes in a mightier-than-thou way. Twilight Sparkle blushed, turning and looking at the pink mare apologetically. The purple unicorn turned her ears back, a little pathetic. "Yes, exactly." Pinkamena pushed her mane behind her ear, looking around the room again. While Death seethed in the corner, unsure what to do, she pondered anything else he'd done to make Twilight's death imminent. Nothing that she could see. "Just be careful, huh?" Twilight sulked a little, but nodded. She didn't want to blow herself up. Death and Pinkamena exchanged an icy glance. She gestured with a toss of her head for him to come outside with her. "Thank you," Twilight offered meekly as Pinkamena left. "Yep," the pink mare said flatly, for more interesting quarry was following her. Death swept his cloak along the stairs, his frame clattering hollowly as he made his way outside. They stood outside, staring at each other. The early winter made it dark outside already. Squaring off with each other in the darkness, she stared into his face. I can't let you run around killing ponies like that. Let them die of natural causes, she demanded. Death tossed his head back, clattering his jaw animatedly. That was his laughing sound, she already knew. What are you planning next? She said, voice flat and demanding. He went a little more still, staring at her. Well, she snapped, tossing her curtain-like mane impatiently. Speak up! She lifted a hoof, leaning forward like she might strike him at any moment. Death's jaws opened all the way and he tilted his head back at her. No tongue, no lips. She suddenly realized. Oh, you can't. She face-hoofed with frustration. Clattering laughter. Growling, she raised her hoof to threaten him. Go someplace else, then. I have friends and companions here, and I will always be there before you. Always, she promised. Death cocked his head. Was that a challenge? A mortal mare challenging the aspect of death? While under his regalia he was no different than she, in his current form she didn't have a prayer. His molten glare rose in temperature, replacing the black eye sockets with flickering red. She snarled at him, pawing the ground a few times with her hoof. Leaning, he swatted a patch of ice lilies with his hoof. They turned black in an instant, then burst into ash. Warning enough? Pinkamena charged head-on, shouting wordlessly. Death lowered his head, squaring his shoulders and clattering his jaw a few times. Standing in front of the library door it would be more than easy. The pink mare rocketed into him, passed straight through like he was a ghost, and slammed herself face first into the door. Blood blossomed from her muzzle, and she staggered with a screeching cry. Death's jaw rattled and his whole frame shuddered with silent, helpless laughter. Death stood to one side when Twilight Sparkle came to the door. Rainbow Dash, you need to stop flying into the... Oh, it's you, Pinkamena. The purple mare looked surprised. I thought you'd gone. Sorry, let me try that again. I thought you'd gone. Hey, you're bleeding. She looked alarmed, for the trickle of red on her face was growing bigger by the moment. Staggering to her feet, Pinkamena shouted, Back up, I'm fine, as best she could. She hadn't broken her nose, but the free-flowing blood made her sound terrible. She walked sideways for a time, disoriented and angry. She looked back and forth for Death, but didn't see him anywhere. A trail of black mist remained where he once stood, and soon that was gone as well. She swore colorfully, making Twilight's nose wrinkle a little. As the pink mare rushed away into the night, the innocent librarian made a face at the splatter of blood on her door. Ugh! The splatter of blood on her door. The midnight court in Canterlot was not often attended by many ponies, to the point where Luna had taken to reading novels during it. She was lucky to get 10 ponies on any given night, compared to her sister who saw hundreds every day. It bothered the wrathful goddess of the night, but at least she had her lunar stallions to play with. The private guards were more ornaments than anything, but they were handsome and fun to play tricks on. Chuckling, she often played phantom sounds to keep them on their toes, a tinkling of glass in a dark corner here, a hiss of a snake in that one over there. They'd gotten into the habit of checking her over their shoulders, for she could not keep a straight face when she was being playful. Soon, a stallion approached her, cloaked in darkness. She looked up, then let out a breath. It was not who she thought, but a stranger off the street. He fell to all 4 knees and bowed until his mane grazed the floor. Your respect pleases us, stranger. Speak thy name, and voice thy concerns, Luna said, her mane floating ethereal with no breeze at all. What brings thou to the midnight courts, to the princess of the night? It wasn't quite the royal Canterlot voice, but it was pretty close. He pulled his hood back, meek before the goddess' presence. Her twin royal guards gave their customary once-overs, judging him not a threat. They stayed as stock-still as they usually were. Your Majesty, he bowed once more, then finally rose to his hooves. "Speak, citizen," Luna said aloud, leaning forward with interest. He'd come in cloak and hood, perhaps not wanting to be identified by other ponies, but here all was to be laid bare if help was to be expected. "My name is Mountainhide. I am infertile," he blurted. There was silence, and Luna blinked. "Don't laugh. Do not laugh. Whatever you do, do not laugh." "It was so flat and blatant, though. My grandmammy told my wife and I that you were also a goddess of fertility, not just a goddess of the night." "A goddess of death as well," Luna thundered, making sure he got the complete picture. The stallion fell to his knees, shivering, then all the way to his belly to bow in fear. "We serve many functions, stallion. Why dost thou come before us with such a statement?" She leaned forward on her throne, as vocal as ever. I was hoping you could help me with that," he said, his face turning a lovely shade of scarlet. "My wife and I have tried everything. Herbs, medicine, artificial insemination." He trailed off, squirming uncomfortably at speaking aloud of such private matters. "And we want a foal or two so badly." He looked up at his goddess pleadingly. Luna considered Mountainhide with a steely frown, eyeing him up and down. It had been millennia since such a request had been made of her. Celestia had complained to her perhaps a month ago that no one asked for marriages to be blessed anymore, and that saddened her a bit. It was a happy pleasure to see each new couple before they started their lives together. Now, 1,000 years later, this stallion merely wanted offspring with his beloved. "What makest thou think we would raise a hoof to help thee? Perhaps your infertility is decided by fate, and you shalt have no foals." She raised a commanding hoof, then stomped it. "But you're a goddess," he cried, tears rushing to his big soft eyes. "You could do anything." His voice cracked a little. "Please, you are her last hope. I would not bother you otherwise, even if it was just for one night. Please!" He pleaded with hooves pressed together. His blind conviction that Luna could do anything pleased her. While it wasn't strictly true, it made her feel a bit better about the midnight court being so empty. She rose from her throne, which startled her guards out of their dazes. Walking down the steps of the dais, she came to stand in front of him. He sank to his belly again, shivering and not daring to look into her face. Her massive hoof reached out, pressing hard under his chin to tilt his head up. "Look upon us, Mountainhide," she said aloud, leaning forward. He did so, not so sure his outburst hadn't just gotten him thrown in a dungeon or something. "Thy faith in us pleases us," she smiled gently, then tugged his head forward and pressed her lips into his mane. She kissed the top of his head, tender. There was something magical, something wonderful about the gesture. He felt a certain virility rise in his chest. "Thy seed shalt be fertile until dawn. Go home and be with thy wife," she decreed. "Upon the dawn thou shalt be as barren as thou were when thou entered our court." "Oh, thank you, my princess! Thank you! Thank you!" He wept and kissed her hooves and blubbered helplessly. "Be gone with you," Luna said bombastically after a few moments, a smile of mischief on her lips. "Thy clock is ticking, and no mare enjoys a soggy-eyed stallion." That sent Mountainhide running. His hoofbeats faded with distance, and she smirked a bit. Both lunar stallions gave her silent, curious looks. "Poor guilt-ridden fool," she said, shaking her head. "'Twas not he who was infertile. 'Twas his wife." She allowed herself a small smile. "Though we can appreciate a stallion that takes the initiative to please his wife." A chuckle rose to her lips, and she went back to her throne. Sitting daintily upon it, she informed the lunar stallions. "She shalt be fertile for a night, then. I deem it so." A black chuckle echoed over the high, vaulting ceiling of the midnight court. The startled expression on Princess Luna's face told the lunar stallions it was not one of her pranks. They sprang forward, looking around feverishly. A pair of eyes watched them from the deepest corner in shadow.
It is good to know the magic of a goddess is going to good use.
What brings thou to our court, Death? Luna frowned, not rising from her throne. The expression she wore was, at best, annoyed, at worst, angry. The lunar stallions backed off a bit, but still flanked the princess.
10 more karmatic deaths, he said, not moving from shadow. I have 10 more souls for the great beyond.
Luna almost grimaced, but held her expression neutral. He worked fast. Although he'd been death for some time now, he could not deposit the souls he collected without Princess Luna's aid. Thy work in Ponyville is more rapid than expected, Luna said, raising a dinner plate-sized hoof. On the far wall, a portal ripped itself open, spinning into existence. Both lunar stallions covered their faces, for no mortal pony could look beyond the veil and stay sane. Luna waited patiently while Death donned his cape and exploded into flame, illuminating the shadows he stood in. Emerging as a skeleton of unholy, fear-inducing darkness, he pulled back the side of his cloak. The princess watched him work gingerly. Call him anything she desired, he certainly knew how to handle tender things like souls. Depositing them into the portal, he nodded with a clack of his bony jaws. The portal snapped shut, and there was silence. What news, if any, Stallion of Death? The Princess of the Night ventured, cocking her head at him. Death tilted his head, reaching and undoing the clasp on his cloak. His organs, muscles, skin, and fur imploded back onto his body.
There is a pink mare in Ponyville that can see me, he grouched at her. I don't like it.
We know of her. She is called Pinkamena. She disobeys us often. Luna growled a little, trying to keep up her regal posture as she placed her royal hindquarters back onto the pillow where they belonged.
Why not just kill her?
Death said flatly. We did. She didn't stay dead, Luna said, rolling her eyes in a very unprincess-like way. Death looked startled.
What?
He hoofed at the ground a few times.
Is she immortal?
No. A full hood accident split her mind in two. We only killed half of it. The alicorn stopped the conversation and briefly filled him in on everything that had happened thus far. She saw his scowl deepen into a grimace of disapproval. Hast thou encountered her many times? Luna asked.
3 times so far, yes. She tried to charge me head-on today. Broke her face on a door.
He smiled grimly when Luna threw her head back and laughed like a thunderstorm. The room shuddered on its foundations before she managed to stifle herself, an honest look of embarrassment on her face. Shaking her head, she bade him to continue. She won't give up, will she? Luna shook her head. Voice is mixed up.
She won't give up, will she?
Luna shook her head. She's already prevented, at least 5 deaths now? He scowled dangerously, pulling his hood back up, and closing his cloak around himself.
I already tried to iron out several of the deaths she made me miss before. A stallion called Big Macintosh, a filly named Apple Bloom, and a stallion called Lickety Split. She has blocked me at every turn, and the fabric of fate will get wrinkled at this rate.
It is thy job to iron out such wrinkles, Luna said, a little snottily.
I know, princess,
Death growled, reaching for the clasps.
But no mortal mare can stay the hoof of death forever. If I have to stop her directly, I will.
He glared at nothing, then snapped the clasp of his cloak. His body began to melt into its skeletal form, catching fire by magic.
Thou cannot just go touch her, Death. Her death is not destined to be so blunt, Luna warned, frowning. Much less so blatant. Doesn't keep me from striking a knife in her back while I'm in my mortal form. His mouth and tongue exploded into dark fire, rendering him speechless. Soon he was skeletal again, ash raining down around his hooves. He tossed his head a few times, rearing up and then vanishing into a puff of black mist. If he could not beat Pinkamina's death, that wouldn't keep a perfectly normal mortal stallion from just murdering her.